Let's dive into an exciting game that begins with the Reti Opening, an elegant and flexible choice often favored by one of the world's top chess talents, Gukesh D. In this match, his first challenger is Nodirbek Abdusattorov. Gukesh opens with knight to f3, setting the stage for a strategic battle rooted in the quiet strength and deep ideas of the Reti. White maintains great flexibility by not pushing any central pawns right away, but still brings out a piece, the king's knight, that applies pressure to the center and prepares for kingside castling. Black answers with pawn to d5, immediately claiming central space. Then white plays pawn to g3, signaling an intention to fianchetto the king's bishop. Black develops the king's knight to f6, and after white positions the king's bishop to g2, black continues building a strong center by playing pawn to c5. White castles the king, securing safety, while black develops the queen's knight to c6 with clear intentions of playing pawn to a5, a move that would give black serious control in the middle of the board. White wants to stop that idea, and the best way is to strike with pawn to d4, directly challenging black's control over the e5 square. Now, if black captures on d4, white can respond by recapturing with the queen's knight. Black may then go ahead with pawn to e5, gaining space with tempo. However, white can exchange on c6, and after black recaptures, the central structure looks impressive but is not entirely stable. White's powerful bishop on g2 is perfectly placed to target the weaknesses around those central pawns. The next move Gukesh plays is pawn to c4, increasing pressure on the pawn at d5. That pawn is pinned and cannot capture without losing the knight on c6, and if white captures that knight, it would come with a fork, threatening the rook in the corner and gaining a serious advantage. Instead of capturing on b2, black chooses a safer route, sliding the rook off the long diagonal to avoid tactical threats, while simultaneously pressuring the pawn on b2. Gukesh calmly continues developing, bringing the dark-squared bishop to g5, pinning the knight on f6 to the queen, a move that weakens the defense of the d5 pawn. At this point, black could consider grabbing the pawn on b2, but that would invite serious complications. If white opens up the center, black's king, still stuck in the middle, could come under immediate fire. So, rather than taking risks, black prioritizes king safety by developing the bishop to e7, clearing the way to castle. White responds with the queen's knight to c3, increasing the pressure on the d5 pawn. After black castles the king to safety, white is ready to strike. Gukesh captures the knight on f6, eliminating a key defender. When black recaptures, white immediately takes on d5, and after a quick exchange, his knight lands in the heart of the board, firmly planted on a central outpost. Although white has won a pawn and secured an active knight, black's king is now safe, and that gives black the freedom to finally capture the b2 pawn. But just as black grabs it, white swings the queen to a4, targeting the pawn on a7 and creating tactical pressure. However, this move leaves the pawn on e2 hanging, and black doesn't miss it, snatching it with the rook. Rather than rushing to take the pawn on a7, Gukesh calmly lifts the rook from a1 to d1, directly eyeing black's queen and intensifying central pressure. We've now reached a crucial point in the game. White is threatening to eliminate black's bishop pair, a valuable long-term asset, and black must now decide whether allowing that trade will weaken his position or if he can safely continue. As it turns out, it would actually be perfectly fine. At this point in the game, although white is eyeing tactical possibilities, there isn't an immediate threat of a devastating discovered attack, mainly because if white tried something like knight to e7, black could simply recapture with the queen, keeping everything under control. More importantly, black is still up a pawn, so if he simply chose to consolidate his material advantage with a move like pawn to a6, he'd retain his extra pawn and wouldn't be too concerned about white trading off the bishop pair. Even if white were to remove one of the bishops, black would still be solid and slightly ahead. However, instead of calmly defending and holding on to the bishop pair with a quiet move, black chooses to actively preserve the pair by repositioning the light-squared bishop to g5. This allows white to launch a countermeasure, pawn to h4, aimed at chasing that bishop away from the e7 square. This square is critical because white is starting to eye dangerous ideas involving a discovered attack with the knight jumping to e7, especially now that the center is more open. Recognizing the danger, black realizes the bishop on g5 could become a tactical liability and admits the misstep by pulling it back to f6. In this situation, a natural follow-up for white would be to first capture the a7 pawn, gaining material, and then consider taking the bishop later if the opportunity still stands. But black refuses to let go of the bishop just yet. Rather than playing it safe or repositioning, he stubbornly retreats the bishop all the way to h6, insisting on keeping the pair intact. That's when things start tipping heavily in white's favor. The reason the evaluation bar and engines love white's position here is because of a powerful, almost hidden move, queen to a 3. This subtle queen move ramps up pressure on the rook on f8 while setting up serious threats involving knight to e7. If black fails to respond accurately, the game could collapse very quickly. For example, white queen takes on e7. Now if black plays a passive or irrelevant move like pawn to f6, white strikes instantly with knight to e7, a check that forces the king to move. Once the king is displaced, white captures the queen on d8, gaining a massive material advantage and likely securing a winning position. This entire sequence showcases the harmony of white's piece coordination, exploiting black's misplaced bishop and lack of coordination. Gukesh's ability to maintain both strategic and tactical pressure is what makes this line so dangerous, and why even a single inaccurate move from black can lead to a swift downfall. To avoid any dangerous checks or discovered attacks, black decides to move the king out of the center right away. In response, white plays pawn to a 4, beginning the advance of his powerful passed pawn toward promotion. Black shifts his queen to e8, stepping off the rook's file while also targeting the a4 pawn. White calmly brings the queen back to c5, attacking the rook and hinting at a tactical idea, jumping the knight to c7 to deflect the queen from defending the rook. Sensing the danger, black sidesteps the threat entirely by playing pawn to g6, which allows the bishop to protect the rook. However, the a-pawn is now under threat, so white pushes it further with pawn to a5, keeping it safe and moving closer to promotion. Black responds with pawn to e4, cutting off the long diagonal and restricting white's bishop. Undeterred, white plays knight to c7, directly attacking the queen. Black retreats the queen to a 4, and now white brings the rook over to a 1, not only attacking the queen again, but also placing the rook behind the passed pawn, a key strategic goal in endgames. The best defensive idea for black in this position would be to move the queen to c2, offering a queen trade. Exchanging queens would reduce white's attacking potential and give black control of the second rank. Additionally, removing white's queen would severely reduce the pressure that supports the promotion of the a-pawn. However, black instead plays queen to b3, keeping queens on the board but allowing white to push the pawn again. White plays pawn to a 6, and suddenly it's incredibly difficult for black to stop the pawn from queening. In a final attempt to shake things up, black plays pawn to e3, trying to introduce chaos into the position. But white should not take this pawn because black would respond with a discovered royal fork, attacking both king and queen. Gukesh, staying calm under pressure, calculates carefully here. He must determine if his king can survive black's counterplay. If it does, then promotion is unstoppable with so many pieces covering the promotion square on a 8. After deep calculation, Gukesh finds the winning move, pawn to a 7. The pawn is now just one square away from queening, and black has no good way to stop it. Suppose black plays bishop to b7. After any exchanges, white will still be able to promote successfully with the help of the queen, rook, and bishop all watching the a8 square. Seeing this, black goes for a desperate attack. Playing pawn takes f2 to open lines toward white's king. But this is where Gukesh's calculation truly shines. He cannot take the pawn back because after a series of forced moves, black would play bishop to e3, trapping white's queen even after promoting. The only move that keeps white ahead is king to h2, avoiding danger while guarding the g3 pawn. Black plays rook to e3, aiming at g3, but Gukesh calmly promotes the a-pawn. After black captures on g3, white strikes with queen to a 5, forking the king and rook. White wins the rook, gains a second queen, and soon after, black resigns. A precise and brilliant finish by Gukesh.